Welcome back, deep divers. Ready to explore another theological puzzle with us today?
Always up for a good mystery.
Well, get ready to unpack a big one. Original sin. We're talking about its historical roots, the big debates, and what it all means for, well, us.
This isn't just some abstract theological idea either. It gets to the heart of how we understand ourselves, our relationship with God, the whole shebang.
Our guide for this deep dive is a fascinating theological study titled, I Believe in God the Father Almighty, Creator of Heaven and Earth. Don't worry, we'll be breaking it down into bite-sized pieces.
And you might be surprised to learn that some of the most common assumptions about this topic, particularly when it comes to Augustine, miss the mark.
Augustine. Now, there's a name that practically defines original sin for a lot of people. But what's the common view of his position? What do most people think he believed?
Well, people tend to picture Augustine as this kind of stern figure laying down the law, saying we're all stained with sin from the moment we're born, even babies.
Yeah, I've heard that one. Like we're all just doomed from the get-go because of something Adam and Eve did way back when.
Exactly. And it's no wonder people have a hard time swallowing that, right? But when you really dig into Augustine's writings, you find a lot more nuance than that.
So what are we missing? How do Augustine's actual views differ from the popular caricature?
Well, for one thing, Augustine was very careful about his terminology. He was a lawyer before he was a theologian, so he was used to making fine distinctions.
Stickler for the details, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what kind of legal jargon are we talking about? Break it down for us.
One crucial distinction he makes is between culpa and riatus. Culpa refers to personal guilt, the blameworthiness for something you yourself have done.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does riatus come in?
Riatus is more like a legal liability, a debt that's owed. Think of it like inheriting a massive debt from your great-great-great-grandfather that you had nothing to do with, but you're still on the hook for it.
Oof, that's a heavy inheritance. But I see where you're going with this. So Augustine is saying that we inherit the consequences of Adam's sin, even if we aren't personally guilty of it.
You got it. It's this idea that Adam's sin created a kind of separation from God, a debt that we, as his descendants, are born into. It's not that we're personally to blame for that original sin, but we experience the effects of it.
Okay, so that's the legal side of things. But how did Augustine believe this inherited debt, this separation, actually played out in our lives?
Well, he talked about it in terms of concupiscence. It's a word that basically means disordered desire.
Concupiscence. Okay, you're going to have to unpack that one for me. It sounds a little intense.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of it this way. Even from a young age, we experience this internal pull towards things that aren't good for us, right? This inclination to be selfish, to give in to those, I know I shouldn't, but impulses.
Oh, I know those impulses all too well. It's like that little voice in your head saying, go ahead, one more cookie won't hurt, even though you know it probably will.
Exactly. And that, according to Augustine, is concupiscence in action. It's this inherent tendency to choose what's easy or pleasurable, even when we know it's not truly good for us.
So it's like this built-in proclivity to make bad choices, even when we don't want to. I'm starting to see why original sin has gotten a bad rap.
Yeah. But again, it's important to remember that Augustine is making a nuanced argument here. He's not saying we're all just inherently bad or destined to sin. It's more like we're born with this predisposition, this leaning towards selfishness and disobedience that we have to constantly struggle against.
It's like we're born with the deck stacked against us, but we still have the capacity to choose differently. So where does that leave the whole issue of babies and damnation? Did Augustine really believe that unbaptized infants were doomed?
That's a tough one, and honestly, it's a point of much debate, even within Christian theology. It's true that Augustine did believe unbaptized infants wouldn't attain salvation. He saw baptism as the way they were formally incorporated into the faithful.
Right, baptism as a kind of initiation into the community of faith. So, what did he believe happened to those babies who died without being baptized?
Well, it's crucial to understand that Augustine's views on this evolved over time, and even within the Western Church, there have been different interpretations.
So what you're saying is, it's not as simple as saying Augustine believed all unbaptized babies were going to hell.
Exactly. It's way more complex than that. Later interpretations, even those building on Augustine's thinking, proposed that while these infants might not experience the fullness of salvation, it didn't necessarily mean they suffered, more like a state of separation.
So a lot of nuance and debate, even around Augustine's own views. It's interesting, though, how this idea of inherited sin, of being marked by something that happened long before we were born, continues to resonate, even today. It's like we intuitively sense that something isn't quite right in the world, that there's this brokenness we can't quite escape.
And that brings us to another fascinating wrinkle in Augustine's thinking. You see, even he acknowledged the mystery surrounding how sin is actually transmitted from Adam to us.
Oh, so he had the what, but not the how.
Precisely. He proposed the idea of seminal nature, suggesting sin was passed down biologically, like a hereditary trait. But even he admitted that the exact mechanics of it were beyond his full comprehension.
It's almost as if he was saying, look, I don't have all the answers, but I know there's something real here, something worth pondering.
Exactly. And that, I think, is what makes Augustine such an enduring figure. He wasn't afraid to say, I don't know, to wrestle with those big, unanswered questions.
It makes you realize that even the most brilliant theological minds don't have it all figured out, which is kind of comforting when you think about it.
Absolutely. It reminds us that it's okay to sit with those unanswered questions, to keep searching, keep exploring. But on that note of not having all the answers, we'd be remiss not to mention the Pelagian controversy, right? After all, Augustine's ideas weren't universally accepted. In fact, they sparked a heated debate with another prominent thinker. Yeah, Augustine had some serious competition in the theological ring, and his opponent wasn't some lightweight either. We're talking about Pelagius, a charismatic theologian with a very different take on human nature.
Well, I've heard the name, but give us the rundown. What is Pelagius' big idea?
Imagine a message that's basically like, hey, you're not stuck with Adam's baggage. You've got this. You're born with the power of free will. You can choose good. You can be righteous, all on your own.
Wow, talk about a confidence boost. I could see how that would be appealing. No wonder Augustine felt a little threatened.
Right. But it's not like Pelagius was just making this stuff up. His thinking had deep roots in philosophy, particularly an idea that was all the rage back then called Neoplatonism.
Neoplatonism. Okay, time for a quick crash course. What's the gist?
Imagine this. Deep down, beneath all the messiness of being human, we all have a spark of the divine within us.
Okay, I like where this is going. So it's like we're all carrying around this inner spark of the divine.
Exactly. And Neoplatonism taught that we could actually fan that spark, nurture it through virtuous living, and ultimately achieve a kind of self-divinization.
So it's not just about being good. It's about tapping into our own inner divinity. That's a powerful idea.
Right. And that's where it gets really interesting, because if you buy into this Neoplatonic worldview, like Pelagius did, then Augustine's whole theory of original sin starts to look a little shaky.
Okay, I see the conflict brewing here. How so?
Well, if we're all born with this pure, unstained potential for goodness, this inner spark of the divine, then the idea that we inherit Adam's sin, that we're somehow tainted from birth, it just doesn't quite fit, does it?
Like, those two ideas are fundamentally incompatible. You can't really have both.
Exactly. It's like trying to mix oil and water.
Yeah.
And that's what made this debate so explosive. It wasn't just about theological nitpicking. It was about two fundamentally different ways of understanding what it means to be human.
So this was a clash of the titans. What happened? Did everyone just pick a side, Augustine or Pelagius?
You might think so, right? Especially with Augustine being such a powerhouse in the Western Church. But the reality is, this debate raged across the Christian world.
Oh, really? So it wasn't just a West versus East kind of thing?
Nope, not at all. In fact, Pelagianism ended up being condemned in both the East and the West.
Wow, I had no idea. I always assumed this was a purely Western showdown. Tell me more about how it played out in the East.
Well, picture this. We've got councils being convened in Carthage, Augustine's stomping grounds, denouncing Pelagius' ideas as heresy. But meanwhile, Pelagius had a right-hand man, a guy named Celestius, who decided to take their theological roadshow east.
Celestius. Wasn't he kind of like the Robin to Pelagius' Batman?
Exactly, the dynamic duo of early church controversy. So Celestius sets off, thinking he's going to win hearts and minds with the Pelagian gospel. But let's just say things didn't exactly go as planned.
Oh, what happened?
He ends up getting condemned at the Council of Ephesus, and then he gets the boot from Constantinople for good measure. Talk about striking out.
Ouch. So much for winning over the Eastern Church.
Right. It just goes to show that this wasn't some regional squabble. This was a debate that went straight to the core of Christian belief, and it was happening everywhere.
It's amazing to think how these theological disputes could reverberate so widely, even back then. But speaking of the heart of the debate, wasn't there a specific Bible verse that everyone kept citing?
You're talking about Romans 5.1, just one little verse, and yet it became this massive battleground.
Oh yeah, Romans 5.12. Isn't that the one that says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned? Something like that.
That's the one. But the real kicker is that last part, because all sinned. It's one of those phrases that can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways depending on how you slice it.
Oh, I know how that goes. It's like one of those sentences that can have totally different meanings depending on where you put the comma.
Yeah.
So, what's the grammatical puzzle here?
It all hinges on this one Greek phrase, epho, which can mean a bunch of different things. In whom, because of which, even with the result, that. And depending on which one you choose, the whole meaning of the verse shifts.
Wow. Talk about a theological minefield.
Yeah.
So, how did Augustine interpret that critical phrase? What was his take on epho?
Yeah. Augustine was a big fan of the in whom interpretation. He argued that Paul was saying we all sinned in Adam, meaning we were collectively present with him in that original act of disobedience.
Okay, so back to that corporate personhood idea we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's like Augustine is saying that even though we weren't physically there in the Garden of Eden, we're still bound to Adam, sharing in the consequences of his choice.
Exactly. And it's not like this idea came out of nowhere. We see hints of it in other Jewish writings from around the time of Paul, too.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there's this text called For Esdras, for example, which talks about how Adam's sin brought death into the world and planted this evil seed in the human heart.
An evil seed. That's a powerful image. So even back then, they were grappling with this idea that Adam's sin wasn't just his own. It somehow corrupted human nature itself.
Exactly. And then you have other texts like the Apocalypse of Baruch, which offer a slightly different perspective. They still talk about Adam's sin having consequences for all humanity, but they also emphasize God's mercy and the possibility of overcoming those consequences.
So even within Second Temple Judaism, there were different ways of understanding Adam's legacy, different interpretations of what it meant for humanity. But this idea of corporate personhood, of being interconnected and sharing in the consequences of Adam's choice, that seems to be a recurring theme.
Absolutely. And it's a theme that carries over into early Christian thought, too. We see the church fathers wrestling with these same questions about Adam, sin, and human nature.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those church fathers. Who were the big voices weighing in on this debate?
Well, one figure who doesn't mince words is Irenaeus, writing in the late 2nd century. He states very clearly that all humanity was implicated in Adam's sin. He even uses the phrase, we had offended God in the first Adam.
Okay, so that idea of corporate personhood is front and center for Irenaeus. We're not just individuals, we're part of this larger human story that begins with Adam.
Exactly. And then you have other church fathers like Origen who added their own nuances to the conversation. Origen was a fascinating figure, brilliant but also a little controversial in his day.
How so?
Well, for one thing, he drew a distinction between swords, which is kind of like a stain or corruption, and actual sin.
So a difference between being marked by Adam's sin and actually choosing to sin ourselves.
Exactly. It's a bit similar to how Augustine distinguished between inherited liability and personal guilt, and Origen even used infant baptism as evidence for his view.
Oh, how so?
He argued that if infants are born completely innocent, then there's no need to baptize them. The very fact that we baptize babies, he said, suggests that they too bear the mark of Adam's fall, this sword that needs to be cleansed.
It's amazing how this debate about infant baptism goes all the way back to the early church. And it all circles back to this fundamental question of what it means to be human, what we're born with, and whether it's possible to escape the legacy of the past.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that even in the Eastern Church, where you might expect more pushback against Augustine's ideas, prominent figures like Gregory of Nyssa and Cyril of Alexandria also talked about humanity being bound up with Adam in his fall. They may have used slightly different language or emphasized different aspects, but that core connection remained.
So while there are undeniable differences in emphasis and interpretation, there's also a clear thread running through early Christian thought about the lasting impact of Adam's choice and what it means for us. It's like this echo that reverberates through the centuries.
And that's what makes this topic so fascinating. It's not about finding one right answer that everyone agrees on. It's about engaging with these different voices, these different perspectives, to gain a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what's at stake.
That's the beauty of these deep dives, isn't it? We're not looking for easy answers, but embracing the complexity of questions that have challenged thinkers for centuries.
Absolutely. And I think those centuries of debate teach us something important. This isn't just some abstract theological puzzle. It's a question that goes to the very heart of what it means to be human.
And on that note, thanks for diving deep with us today. We hope this exploration of original sin has sparked your curiosity and maybe even left you with a few more questions than you started with.
After all, that's where the real journey begins.
Until next time, keep those theological wheels turning.